right, let me introduce Celeste H. Padilla. H stands for Heather. Celeste has spent her career in public service, either at the University of Texas at Austin or in various state agencies. Her work experience includes 15 years of managing education-related grants, higher education, secondary education, and workforce education. She joined TEA in December 2015 as a grant manager with the Grants Administration Department and is working to learn all the aspects of the Carl D. Perkins Grant. We're very happy to have her as a team member with us, by the way. Celeste is originally from New Mexico and has lived in Austin for over 26 years. While not working, she can be found riding her bike all over town or camping and hiking in Central Texas and beyond. Please help me welcome Celeste Padilla.
Thank you. I'll start. Good afternoon. So what we're going to talk about today is I'm going to do an overview of Perkins. Basically talk about the Perkins funding, how you become eligible, how we determine your allocation. We'll talk a little bit about the shared services arrangements. We'll talk a little bit about use of funds, what is allowable, what isn't allowable. Tell you about the reallocation process that takes place every year, how to do amendments. I will talk very often about resources that I want you to know about, and then Diane and her team are going to help me answer your questions. So, sound all right? So let's start at the beginning and talk about how funds are distributed. So TEA, we get the funding, of course, from the U.S. Department of Education. And all of the Perkins federal funding comes to TEA. Then we split that money with the Higher Education Coordinating Board. The State Board of Education determined this split, and it's 70% TEA and 30% the Higher Education Coordinating Board. And they, of course, in turn, make grants to community colleges. So 70% secondary education, 30% post-secondary. Then we take that 70% and we divide it into 3 buckets, if you will. So we have a large bucket, 85% of the funds. That goes to you guys, to LEAs. Then 10% goes into another bucket that we use for leadership grants, like the grant that actually allows for this type of academy to happen. And then 5% is retained for TEA state level administration. So this slide here just shows you a comparison of what we have in that 85% bucket. That's that $55 million. And even though $55 million sounds like a lot of money, kind of pales in comparison to what's available through the Foundation School Program, almost $2 billion. So that's the funding that we're talking about. The $55 million is what we're talking about today, primarily. So how does one become eligible for Perkins funding? Well, funds have to be awarded to CTE programs of sufficient size, scope, and quality to be effective. And Texas defines size, scope, and quality in terms of enrollment in CTE coherent sequences as you guys report in PEIMS. So when we talk about size, scope, and quality, it's defined by evidence of a coherent sequence of CTE courses. That's where we talk about the programs of study and the career clusters. All of that comes into play in helping determine your eligibility. And size is determined by how many coherent sequence takers you have. So to be eligible, you have to have a minimum of 10, and for charter schools, a minimum of 5 coherent sequence takers. So and I'm going to talk about this in a little while. Diane and her CTE staff are taking a look at some eligibility issues. You may have already heard about that a little bit, but we're looking to see, is it enough to have 300 students taking a CTE course, but only 1, 2, or 5 in a coherent sequence? And that you might be hearing, I think you will be hearing, more conversation about that as the year goes on. And we can talk about that more a little bit later as well. So we use the prior year fall snapshot data in PEIMS to determine your eligibility. Your Code 2 students help determine your eligibility. LEAs that don't enroll students in coherent sequences are not eligible. So that's what I was saying before. You might have a lot of students taking CTE courses, but if they're not in a coherent sequence, that may make you ineligible. It's getting those students in the coherent sequences that is really important. Okay, so that's very briefly eligibility. Now let's talk about how TEA determines the size of your grant, what your allocation is going to be. Because of course this is all formula funded, so I'll let you know what the formula is. The calculations are essentially based on Census Bureau data, the population and poverty counts of individuals ages 5 through 17. And we look at, the Census Bureau adjusts these counts annually, and that's what we look at. If you're at all familiar with NCLB allocations, we use the very same data that NCLB uses. We also factor in the population and poverty counts for charter schools in your area. How many of you are with a charter school? Okay, so you know, everybody knows that charter schools, they have to fill out and submit to us an SC 5050 form, and that lets us know where their students are being pulled from. So that factors into your formula allocation. Now, I want to make sure you understand that your CTE counts, those coherent sequence takers, that does not contribute, that does not factor into your allocation. That is about eligibility. So there's eligibility and then there's your allocation. So we look at that Census Bureau data that's adjusted annually. 90% of your allocation is based on that. 90%. 70% is based on the poverty counts in your area, while 30% is based on population. What that means, and I've already had a few questions this year, you may notice that your allocation goes down, went down, and you didn't do anything differently and it went down. Well, that could, in some cases anyways, be tied to the fact that your poverty counts in your district went down, which is a good thing. So those poverty and population counts are a huge factor of how your allocation is determined. Just 10% of your allocation is based on your performance. So those of you who have been around for a while know that we have what's called incentive funding. You see your base allocation and then you get an incentive amount. You get that incentive amount if your CTE program is meeting 4 out of the 5 performance measures, you're getting an incentive amount. I will also say that in addition to the CTE staff discussing eligibility and possibly looking at some changes there, they are also looking at some possible changes to incentive. Because really, an incentive should be an incentive. It should really be for those programs that are really doing high quality things and being really effective. And to be honest, right now, virtually everybody gets some incentive funding. So that might be a discussion point throughout the year ahead. How many of you in the room are a fiscal agent for an SSA? Okay, good. And how many of you have been or are part of an SSA? Okay, so what is an SSA then? Well, SSAs are partnerships of one or more LEAs that form a shared services arrangement. The congressional intent of an SSA is that LEAs with really small allocations can leverage their funding, basically get more bang for your buck, to achieve, and this is important, to achieve a mutually beneficial purpose. I'm going to come back to that phrase in a minute. So who can join an SSA? Well, anybody who is eligible to receive Perkins funding can join an SSA if you want to. But there are a couple of instances where TEA says you must join an SSA. If you are a very small district and your allocation is $15,000 or less, we say we want you to join an SSA. Because again, we feel like if you pool the funds, essentially, you can get a greater impact. If you have less than 10 coherent sequence takers or 5 for a charter school, we also say we'd like you to join an SSA. So what do we mean by mutually beneficial purpose, which again is the congressional intent of SSAs? My understanding is that this particular mutually beneficial was a little bit of a discussion point last year. We actually received a little bit more guidance back in December before I really knew what anybody was talking about. We got some guidance from USDE about what do they mean by mutually beneficial. And what they're basically saying is that they want to make sure that when you're a member of a SSA, that the fiscal agent is not simply just flowing those funds back to you. Rather, that there is some intention about how those funds are going to benefit the SSA as a whole. So, if you are the fiscal agent for an SSA and you're budgeting funds in 6493 is a little line item there, we are not going to be asking you, well, we will ask you, if you budget funds there, we're going to ask you who are the funds going to. We want to see who are the member recipients. We're not going to ask you any more detail than that. But what is allowable and unallowable when you have funds budgeted there? Unallowable is like what I said earlier, that the funds are just transferring back to the LEA. Maybe every LEA gets the same amount to purchase supplies and materials. It's really not mutually beneficial. Instead, if a fiscal agent is flowing funds to a member of an SSA to operate a CTE training academy that serves every member of the SSA, that's mutually beneficial. Likewise, if the LEA who's receiving the funds employs a career counselor that helps provide guidance to all members of the SSA, that's also a mutually beneficial purpose. So required uses of funds. There are actually, and you guys probably know this a lot better than I do. Most of you could do the presentation better than I do, but there are 9 required uses of funds with Perkins. And what we say is you have to meet these 9 requirements with either these federal dollars or with your state and local funds. And several of you are looking at this and writing it down or taking pictures, but you don't have to because it's all available for you, and I'll tell you where a couple times. But for now, I'll just go through the 9, and then we'll talk about them a little bit more. Most of you raised your hands and you talked about preparing the Perkins application. Your Bible, while you're doing this, while you're completing the application and while you're budgeting, should be the Perkins guidelines. Does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say thank you? I appreciate the nodding of the head. Yeah, the Perkins guidelines is when you have a question, as you're filling it out, or you get to a point where you're not sure where to go, you need to go to the program guidelines. That is your very first resource. And really you should have tabs on it that tell you where's the budget information, where's the allowable use of funds information. When you guys ask me questions, that's where I go first as well. And these required uses of funds are very prominent in the program guidelines. So, what should you be doing with those funds? Integrating your academic and your CTE courses. Linking your CTE to post-secondary education. Expanding the use of technology in your CTE courses. Providing students with experience and training. And providing professional development to CTE staff. Next, developing and implementing evaluations of CTE programs. You want to find out if you're being effective. Ensuring programs, courses, and technology are modern and relevant. Providing services and activities of sufficient size, scope, and quality to be effective. And lastly, providing activities to prepare special populations for high-skill, high-wage jobs. And Dale talked about that a little bit earlier. So, allowable uses of funds. A lot of the questions that I get and that our negotiators get are, can I use my Perkins dollars to do this? Well, I want to tell you that when you have that question, there are 3 things you should do before you call TEA. One is truly you should go to the program guidelines. There are literally several pages of examples of how you can use the funds and how you cannot use the funds. There must be 36 examples for both allowable and unallowable. If you don't find your answer in any of the examples, then you should think about, okay, is what I want to do, is it meeting one of the required uses of Perkins funds? That's a good question. Your third question to yourself should be, well, am I supplementing my existing program or am I supplanting? And I know you've heard that term before, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more in the next few slides. And then the next thing you should do, if your program guidelines and the required uses of funds and the supplement, not supplant, if that doesn't help answer your question, then you should call TEA. But the people you should call are actually Diane and her staff. Because even though I'm the funding person, use of funds at TEA is a program responsibility. And Diane and I might talk about it, or Dale and I might talk about it, and make sure that we're within federal guidelines and that we're adhering to Edgar. But truly, if you do have questions about use of funds, you can call Dale. Okay, so a couple of examples. You can call Dale, you can call Diane, you can call me, but I might not be able to help you, and we are really supposed to say, oh, I need you to, I'll transfer you to program staff. So we're not trying to not be helpful, but there are some divisions of responsibility within TEA that we have to adhere to. So some examples, and again, these are 4 or 5 examples. The program guidelines have somewhere around 35, 36. Providing career guidance and academic counseling. Providing support for local education and business partners. Improving or developing new CTE courses. Developing initiatives to facilitate that transition to post-secondary education. And providing teacher prep programs that address the integration of academic and CTE. Yes, ma'am.
On the first one on the slide before, does that mean that you can pay a career counselor salary if you've never had one before?
I believe you can pay a career counselor salary. Okay, so unallowable. Again, just some examples. The cost of a membership in a civic organization, not allowable. Hosting or sponsoring a conference, not allowable. Construction or remodeling facilities, you guys know this, not allowable. Salaries and bonuses for classroom CTE teachers, not allowable. Academic remediation for your CTE students. Furniture, unless it's very specific, industry specific, like a dental chair. Or motorized vehicles. Now, I do want to say that these unallowable that I'm talking about here and that are listed in the guideline, those are unallowable uses of federal Perkins dollars. That's what I'm talking about. You have other state and local funds you might very well be able to do some of these things with. Right? You with me? Okay, so receipt of goods and services. A lot of this is some basic, grant management 101. Because basically, your goods must be received and services must be received during the grant period. When you buy a huge bulk of supplies and materials at the very, very, very end of the grant year, it can raise questions. It looks like you're stockpiling. And TEA will evaluate and possibly ask questions, but they'll evaluate that on a case-by-case basis. Now, I do want to say that my understanding, again, is that I believe it was starting the 2015-2016 year, the year that your grants are still active right now, that the end date of Perkins grants changed. They used to change maybe June or July, and now we're taking them all the way to August 15th. And that was done intentionally to provide more flexibility. So your 2015-16 grant, the grant that is active right now, that's good until August 15th. If you still have funds in that grant, you can still utilize that funding. Likewise, your 2016-2017 grant that just opened up for you to apply for, that's going to go all the way through August 15th, 2017. And what we are trying to give you more flexibility. And if you are using funds right now from your 2015-2016 grant, we say that benefits your 2015-16 academic year. And even though your school may be out, it's benefiting, the academic year is defined all the way through August 15th. And that's intentional to help you out. A TEA monitor or a TEA auditor, and I don't know if you guys have had experience with the auditors at TEA, but they're some really, really, really great people and nice guys. They're really not out to like get you, they're really trying to help you. And what they'll do is they will determine something is unallowable or at least ask questions. If you don't document the need for the expenditure, demonstrate that there's a benefit and who the benefit is to. And again, I mentioned, negate the appearance of stockpiling supplies. Reasonable cost, this is really, really basic. It's generally considered reasonable. It's ordinary and necessary to the operation of your grant program. If you can show evidence that you're acting with prudence and you're acting responsibility to the people in your organization and to your grantee recipients, and that there aren't any significant deviations from standard practices at your LEA. It's all relatively straightforward. Okay, I mentioned supplement, not supplant earlier, and federal Perkins dollars are to be used to supplement, that is, increase the level of services, not supplant, not replace funds from non-federal sources. So any activity, and you guys probably know this already, any activity that is required by state law, by the State Board of Education, or your own local board policies cannot be paid for using Perkins funds. You have other funding to do that. So you must maintain documentation that clearly demonstrates the supplementary nature of your Perkins funds. So if you are not sure if you are supplementing or supplanting, you can ask yourself, if I didn't have these federal dollars, would I still be able to conduct this program or provide these services? If the answer is yes, you might be supplanting because it is no longer a supplemental activity. You have to demonstrate that if you didn't have these funds, that activity would not be able to occur. Now, I want to also mention that there is a really great handbook on TEA's website. It's called the Supplement Not Supplant Handbook. And while it might not be riveting, it's got a lot of really good detail, and it has a whole bunch of fairly in-depth examples. And I'll show you where to go to get that. And again, when you guys call me and ask, is it supplementing, is it not, is it supplanting? I don't know the answer right now. Give me another year. And in the meantime, I go to that handbook and kind of walk through your scenario and see if it matches any of the examples in there. So it's good information. Okay, so reallocations. So some of you might administer other federal grants that had carryover, meaning any unused funds from 15-16 could carry over to your 16-17 grant. That is not the case with Perkins. We don't carry over funds. We do, however, provide you with a reallocation amount. And what I mean by that is, if some of you in your 15-16 year didn't spend all your money, there's usually, most LEAs have a little bit left. We basically take all of that money back, and for 15-16, we'll take your unspent 15-16 funds, and in 16-17, we will reallocate that to you. And we reallocate it to you using the very same formula that we used to determine your initial allocation. So what happens is, we try to do this in late November, early December. We run our whole formula and determine how much each LEA will get. We lock down the e-grant system so that you're not able to go in and submit an amendment. We'll send out a listserv message, both Grants Administration listserv and CTE listserv, letting you know, hey, we're locking down the system, and by the way, this is the amount of money that every LEA is going to get. And then our staff will go into your budget, your Perkins budget, and we will adjust your budget. Let's say you're getting $10,000. I'll put $10,000 into your budget, and I'll put it into your highest class object code line item. And then we'll let you know that we're done. If you have a need during that like 2 or 3 week period when the system is locked down and you have an urgent need to get an amendment in, just call us and we'll figure out a way to let you get in. And then if you don't like where we put your money, then you can do it. You can do an amendment. But us doing the adjustment actually saves you a lot of time, and it ends up being easier for us. So that happens every year, late November, early December. So speaking of amendments, how and when? Well, TEA has taken steps in the last couple of years to try to reduce the times when you are required to amend your application. There are actually a lot of changes you can make that don't require you to go in and submit an official amendment. TEA has been trying to provide greater flexibility. It saves you time, it ends up saving us time as well. So, you're probably tired of me saying this, but there is a really, really great resource on TEA's website called When to Amend. And it's a PDF. I'm going to show it to you. It's this nifty little chart. And again, when you call me, right now, when you guys call me with questions, most of the time, I have to go to the website and I've got to look at all my cheat sheets and all my resources because I'm still very much in that learning mode. But this shows you, it'll ask you, are you thinking about amending a state grant or a federal grant? Do you want to do this or do you want to do this? And it walks you through whether or not you do need to do an amendment or not. So I really want to bring your attention to it because it's great. It's a great resource. So an amendment is required when you are adding a class object code that was not previously budgeted, when you're increasing or decreasing the amount of funds in a class object code more than 25% of the total budget. That's an important part, which is why it's in bold. You're adding a type of position that was not initially approved, or you're adding a new line item on any supporting schedule. Those are a few examples of when you do have to submit. But it's not required when you're increasing or decreasing the number of positions approved by 20% or less, when you're increasing a salary amount of funds budgeted for a certain position, or when you're increasing or decreasing the amount of funds in a class object code by less than 25% of the total budget. So sometimes we get amendments submitted and you didn't need to do it. So you can save yourself time by printing out and referring to the when to amend and help guide you to determine if you really do need it or not. Okay, there's another handbook that I want to mention because I think Dale promised that I'm going to talk a little bit more about budget details, and I'm really not. Because I don't know the budget details. I know the budget basics right now, and the fortunate thing for all of us is that we don't have to know the budget details because it's all outlined for me in the Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook. Another nifty handbook that is available on TEA's website. And I'll say this, TEA's website can be a little difficult to navigate. However, once you find the information, there is honestly some really great, very useful information. So I have a lot of things bookmarked and favorited, and I would encourage you to do the same. This particular handbook goes into excruciating detail about costs that do or don't require approval, how you handle technology purchases, unallowable cost, use of federal funds for conferences, use of federal funds for food, field trips, cell phones, travel costs, and not just for your Perkins grant, but if you happen to be managing other grants, this speaks to all of those. A couple of things that I will give some detail on is program income. Some of you guys, your CTE programs are generating income. Let's say you have a culinary program and you have a culinary cafe that generates program income. Those funds need to go back into your grant program. So you can't get money, your culinary cafe is creating income. You can't spend it on another program at your school. It needs to go back into your program. Supplies and materials versus capital outlay. This is a common question. When do supplies and materials become capital outlay? If you are buying a group of items, like a unit, say for a computer lab, and the total cost of those is $5,000 or more, that's capital outlay. Post-secondary tuition costs. You guys probably already know that you cannot pay the tuition cost for an individual. You can, however, pay post-secondary tuition for a group. So I wanted to clarify that. Installation of capital assets. I mentioned earlier that you can't use your federal Perkins dollars for remodeling or construction. However, a little bit of a caveat to that is, let's say you are installing a high-end kitchen for your culinary program, or you're installing an auto body painting booth, and you need ventilation for both of those. Then that would be an allowable use of capital assets. Field trips. Field trips require prior approval, as does out-of-state travel. Out-of-state travel requires approval, and you have to make very, very, very certain that you get that approval before the travel happens. Okay, so expenditure reporting is in the Grants Administration Division, is a cash management function, but I asked the folks in our cash management division what they wanted me to share. And payments that are entered into the expenditure reporting system must be certified by an authorized official. Any of your reporting due dates, if you're not sure, you probably have a lot of dates going on in your daily life. And if you're not sure what the due dates are, a really great resource is the Grant Opportunities page of TEA's website. It's also really helpful if you submit your expenditure once a month. It ends up being very helpful for our staff. I think it ends up benefiting you as well. And then, of course, more guidance can be found on TEA's website. So, I know I've mentioned a lot of resources, and it's really because that's the best place to go. That's where you're going to get the most detailed information, the most accurate information, and the most up-to-date information. TEA also has a help desk. So if you're ever lost, if you are trying to get into your eGrants application and you can't get it, if you're having trouble with your TEAS account, the help desk is a good place to go. Grant Opportunities. Grant Opportunities is the place when you want to find out when a grant is due, when your expenditure report or your final report is due. Grant Opportunities is the place to go. And when you go to Grant Opportunities and you put in Federal Perkins, it also has all the documents you're going to need. It'll point you to the program and fiscal guidelines. It'll point you to a sample application. It'll point you to the out-of-state prior approval travel form, everything you need. And then where I spend most of my time is in the Administering a Grant page of TEA's website. That's where you're going to find a Grant Management Handbook, the Supplement Not Supplant Handbook, the When to Amend PDF. And because we are all living now with the new EDGAR, there are a lot of FAQs that TEA staff last year really spent an inordinate amount of time figuring out how new EDGAR applied and collecting and responding to FAQs. So those are also there for you. And then, of course, if you do have questions, Diane and her staff are available. And I'm available too. I really don't mind having you guys contact me. Just know that I will be going to the resources and I'll say, okay, well, let's get on TEA's website and let's look at this document together. So I certainly don't mind, and I'm happy to help when I can. And I believe that is the extent of my presentation, but I am open to questions as long as Diane and her staff carry through on their promise to help me answer those. Questions? Comments?
So the grant is open now, and so if somebody applies and get their application stamped in or whatever it is, does their grant begin then?
July 1. That's a good question, and I'm glad you said that, because Dale started off talking about the ADC and then showed you the application. If you don't complete and submit your ADC, you won't even see the application. And the reason why the ADC is so important and is the very first step, if you are applying as a member of an SSA, you get a different, if you're a fiscal agent, you get a different application, is what I'm trying to say, versus an independent applicant. So when you click that ADC and submit it to us, that tells the system, oh, send him an independent application, or send this person the application for a fiscal agent. So that's why that's so important. We've had calls, people saying, oh, I don't see the 2016-2017 Perkins application. It's not on my list. Well, that's because you haven't done your ADC yet. You've got to do that first and submit it. And then, yes, to answer your question, your 2016-2017 grant, if you have it, it will start July 1 and go through August 15th, 2017. Yes?
I have one more. And I always trying to summarize things for people, especially when we talk about application. Just because you dropped your application doesn't mean that it's all hunky-dory with TEA. And I'm always cautioning schools that until you get your NOGA in hand, be very careful about the money you spend, because it can always come back to be, the grant app itself can be changed if there's something that's not agreeable. Could you?
Yes, I could. Thank you very much. That's a good point. Submitting your application is the first step. Actually, it's kind of the second step because the ADC is the first step, but you know what I mean. So you submit your application to us. Once we get it, it goes through a review and approval process. So we have a team, a small team, there's 3 people, who literally review every Perkins application. And we call them our grant negotiators. And if they have a question, if something doesn't look right on your application, or you are doing something that you're not allowed to do, or they just have a question, you will get your application sent back to you. Sometimes it'll show up in your e-grants, and you also get an email saying, hey, this needs your attention, or they'll call you. A lot of times we're just kind of picking up the phone and calling you, and they'll help you through it. They are a really, really great team at TEA and are really there to help you work through your application with you. After they review it, then it goes through this whole electronic queue at TEA. They do a fiscal review, then there's a final compliance review, then it goes to different levels, and finally it gets no-good. And so Travis is right, until your application is approved and you have a NOGA, it's still basically, it's pending basically. So you do need to be careful. I would recommend, I recommend that you try to get your application in early, but actually I'm not going to recommend that, because it just depends on your own situation and what you've done with your $15, $16. So you have some flexibility there. Yes?
So a question about dates. So if the application, if July 1st is the date, but the previous year extends to August 15th, then what do I need to know as a administrator that those dates are crossing over for a 6-week time period?
That's a good question. I think that you in your business office need to kind of have that determine how you're tracking expenditures from one grant to the next. It's just a simple case of making sure that you're working with your business office and that they understand. Yeah, sometimes the program people and the business office people, sometimes they're not on the same page. So I would make sure that you do get on the same page with them. Great, well thank you so much. I look forward to working with y'all. You guys have a great team with the CTE folks here, and so I'm happy to be joining them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Celeste. We all have enjoyed working with her so far, and look forward to many more years of working with her. So